last 15 years, from Abu Ghraib on, there was one catastrophe after another that are very reminiscent of all these things that were being exposed during the 1960s. And so there was this massacre in Kandahar where 16 civilians were murdered in the night, and most of them civilians, women and children. Then there was a story about soldiers that had burned up the Quran. Then there was a story about the soldiers who were photographed urinating on the corpses of the killed. And there was a story of soldiers holding up the severed limbs. And in response to every one of those stories, the scripted line from Obama and Hillary Clinton and several generals and Leon Panetta was always the same. They always said, this is not who we are. This is not reflective of us as a country or the military. It's an aberration. These are a few bad apples. And I just find that so appalling, but so illustrative of where we are as a country. It also does speak, I think, to one of the more new aspects of American exceptionalism, which is it's a much more brittle and defensive, and I would say even xenophobic and concept. And it's always, it requires a kind of constant pumping up to keep it going. I mean, the chant USA, 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 how often you hear it, not just at the Olympics, but I don't remember as a little boy hearing that concept. I mean, only because we were so cocky. I mean, we know everybody took it for granted that we were the greatest country in the world. We didn't have to sort of chant it in those days. We just sort of had that in our bones. But now, in the years after Vietnam, people have become more defensive about it. And I'm going to try to illustrate that a little bit because I think one of the things that has allowed us to repackage Vietnam and to put aside its most troubling history and the most damning aspects of its history is to rethink the Vietnam War as essentially an American tragedy. An American tragedy. So that instead of remembering and dwelling on all that we did, all the damage and destruction we did in and to Vietnam, and all that important history, the focus instead has been to think about all the bad things the Vietnam War did to us. And this began almost immediately when Gerald Ford, even a week before the so-called fall of Saigon, was telling America, we really need to put this war aside. This war is finished as far as we're concerned, as if we had nothing to do with it. We can encourage, but as if all we've done is really kind of help out. So I have quite a long passage about Ford, but it even started, and even Carter said, it was asked, what about reparations in Vietnam? No, I don't feel like we owe them anything because this is a quote, the damage was mutual. Can you imagine that? I mean, yes, we lost nearly 60,000 people, but out of a population of more than 200,000, if we had lost the same number proportionate to their population, and Vietnamese lost at least 3 million people, and a population of roughly 35 million, the wall in Vietnam Veterans Memorial would have to include at least 18 to 20 million people. And think about this too, those names would not just be the names of uniformed Americans. From that, at least half of those 20 million names would be the names of women and children and old men civilians, because roughly at least half the casualties in Vietnam. And in Cambodian Laos too, by the way, were civilians. So this repackaging of the war was really, as I say, trying to make it into an American tragedy, and I would then add that who was the chief victim? Somehow we managed to come to the conclusion that, I'm not speaking for everybody, obviously one of the things I try to get across in the book is that the descent of that era does persist. It's just not as well observed, the media doesn't pay attention to it, but many people in this room are part of what I would call the long veterans movement, or the long anti-war movement. So that memory is preserved, but it kind of has somewhat of an underground existence. But in about 5 or 10 pages in a chapter I call No More Vietnams, I tell the story of Brian Wilson, and I'm not going to tell it here because I think many of you know it, but you can find it there. And one of the extraordinary things that happens in the days and weeks and years after he was run over by a munitions train at the Concord Naval Weapons Depot was that there was a kind of a permanent occupation of those tracks, right? For years and even decades. It was kind of a predecessor to the Occupy movement. So dissent continues, but it didn't really carry the day, obviously, because the country really does move to the right in the years after the Vietnam War. But I think one of the broadly learned lessons by the students I've taught for now decades, as they came of age, was, and if you ask them, they might very well say, what's the most shameful thing about the Vietnam War? And they might likely say the most shameful thing about the Vietnam War was the way we treated our veterans returning home. And, I would say, well, yeah, there's some very shameful aspects of that. There's no question that veterans were treated badly. But let me tell you, I think the most shameful abusers of veterans was the United States government. And after all, they sent them to war on a set of lies, to a place where they were widely perceived as foreign invaders, given an impossible military objective. And then when they came home, weren't nearly offered the support and benefits that earlier veterans had received. And the second chief abuser was probably corporate America, who didn't do nearly enough to reach out to veterans and offer them jobs and training, and often scared away by really ugly media, speaking of another corporation, big media's stereotypes of wacko, vets who were drug addled and violence prone. And even the traditional veterans organizations like American Legion and Vietnam Veterans of Foreign Wars did not offer a welcoming hand to veterans. But oddly enough, and I know you all know this, somehow younger people, but not just younger people, a lot of Americans were convinced that the people who did the most to abuse homecoming veterans was the anti-war movement. And we had this idea that protesters like nothing better than to stand, outside military bases or airports and yell epithets like baby killer or literally spit upon returning veterans. And it's a very pervasive idea. I think most of it is a post-war mythology, and some people have written about that. I'm not saying that there wasn't some tension between a significant cohort of veterans and the anti-war movement, but I think those had more to do with class resentment, and which is understandable, just resentment over the difference in experiences. I was over there fighting this impossible war at great risk, and you were back on campus advancing your life and having fun, and I'm pissed for that, and I feel that maybe you're a little sanctimonious in the way that you're condemning the war, because I can't help but feel that you're condemning me personally rather than, Nixon and Kissinger and Johnson. So I get that. But what this myth of the anti-war movement being the chief abuser, what that does, it has a very obvious political function, which is to demonize the anti-war movement. Make them look like, schmucks. And it also, even worse, buries and distorts one of the most important histories that many of you people represent, which is the fact that many veterans came back from Vietnam completely disillusioned, some so disillusioned that they couldn't really engage in political activity, but an extraordinary number joining particularly Vietnam veterans against the war, but other organizations too, and being a key part, I'd say by 1971, the leaders of the the most vital force of the anti-war movement. So that's a history that organizations like Appy can really help to